She remembered the smell of her mother's cloak first. Cedar smoke and iron filings and something sweeter underneath, something she had no name for as a child. She would learn later it was grief, wearing the scent of the living as camouflage. She had been 4 years old when the Vethkaran came. She had been 4 years old when everything she knew became a word she wasn't allowed to say anymore. Her name was Myra Dunville. She was 31 years old, and she had been searching for 27 of them. The colony ship ICV Threshold sat in high orbit above a gas giant called Sorrow's Mouth, not an official designation, just what the cartographers had written on the survey maps in a moment of poetic honesty. The planet's storms were violent and slow. They turned like old men remembering. Myra stood at the observation port on Deck 7 and watched them turn, and did not see them at all. Behind her, the briefing room smelled of recycled air and bad coffee, and the particular exhaustion of people who had been operating at maximum tension for 16 consecutive days. "The signal is consistent with Vethkaran communication architecture," said Commander Darius Holt, pulling up the holographic display for the 4th time as if repetition might change what it showed. "Type beam encrypted burst, compressed into a frequency band they've used since before first contact. The translation subroutines are 83% confident." "What does it say?" said Lieutenant Owen Reyes without looking up from his console. He already knew. He was asking because sometimes saying a thing aloud made it easier to carry. Holt hesitated. "It says, the child remembers the fire, the child is waiting." The room was quiet for a moment in the specific way rooms get quiet when everyone in them is thinking the same thought, but no one wants to be the first to say it. Myra turned from the observation port. She was tall for a human, broad-shouldered, with the kind of stillness that gets built into a person by years of learning not to react. Her hair was dark and cut close on the sides, longer on top, and there was a scar along her left jawline that she'd stopped explaining years ago. She wore a data slate like an extension of her arm. She had not slept more than 4 hours in any given night for 16 days. "It's them," she said. Holt looked at her carefully. He was a good commander, which meant he was good at reading rooms, and what he read in Myra's face right now was something he didn't have a word for either. "We don't know that," he said gently. "It could be bait. It could be a misfire from an automated relay. It could be." "It's the 9th house phrase," Myra said. "Cedar and iron, the remembering fire. That's not a phrase in the standard Vethkaran lexicon. That's 9th house dialect. That's a phrase my mother used." She said it the way people say true things they've waited years to say, not triumphant, not trembling, just level, like setting something heavy down on a table. Holt looked at the display. He looked at her. He looked at Reyes, who gave a microscopic shrug that meant, "I can't tell her she's wrong because she isn't." "The Vethkaran fleet holding position at the Aren boundary," Holt said slowly. 37 warships. If we move toward the signal source." "We move toward the signal source," Myra said. "Myra." "Commander," she said it without heat. "I'm not asking. I'm telling you what I'm going to do. You can put it in my file." She picked up her data slate and walked out. The Vethkaran had come to human space 29 years ago, and they had not come peacefully. That was the diplomatic phrasing. The honest phrasing was, they had arrived in the outer systems like a tide that didn't know what mercy meant, and they had taken what they wanted, and they had left what they didn't. And what they left behind were ruins and grief and children who grew up learning to hate the shape of a certain kind of ship in the sky. The war had lasted 11 years. It had ended in a ceasefire that no one entirely believed in, a line drawn on star charts in a conference room on Meridian Station, with ambassadors who couldn't look each other in the eye and translators who aged 10 years in 2 weeks. The Vethkaran were not small. They averaged 2.3 meters in height. They had 4 upper limbs, 2 primary arms and 2 secondary manipulator limbs that folded against the thorax when not in use, and their faces were structured around a central sensory cluster rather than discrete features, so human expressions never quite mapped onto them. Their blood was dark. Their language had 47 phonemes humans could not reproduce without surgical modification. They built their ships like living things, organic and recursive, and their ships lasted centuries. They did not, historically, take prisoners. That was also the diplomatic phrasing. The honest phrasing was, they took specific individuals for specific purposes, and whether those individuals were considered prisoners depended on who you asked. What they had taken from the Dunville colony on Harrow's Ridge 27 years ago was a 4-year-old child, and her mother and her 2 older brothers and her father. And what they had returned, 8 months later, during the first tentative ceasefire negotiations, was the father and one of the brothers, each with no memory of the 8 months, and a physiological calm that the doctors on Meridian Station described as troubling and the family described as wrong. The child, the mother, and the other brother were not returned, were not mentioned, were, as far as official records were concerned, designated as lost. Myra had grown up with a father who looked at her like she was a stranger he was trying to remember, and a brother who flinched at loud noises, and a grief so specific it had a taste. She had joined the Colonial Science and Survey Corps at 19. She had learned Vethkaran linguistics, all 6 dialects, including Ninth House, which only 40 humans in the galaxy spoke. She had spent 12 years moving through the borderlands between human and Vethkaran space, ostensibly charting stellar anomalies and trade route viabilities, actually following threads. The threads were thin, they broke constantly, she followed them anyway. The signal source was a debris field around a dead moon, 3 light towers inside the Aren boundary. The moon had no official name. On survey maps it was catalogued as KRN 7b. The debris field was what remained of a Vethkaran depot station that had been decommissioned or destroyed. The distinction was unclear, sometime in the last 15 years. Threshold came out of transit drive at the edge of the field, and immediately every alarm on the ship went from green to amber. Active sensor sweeps, said Ensign Combe, her voice carefully professional. 3 sources, Vethkaran architecture. Signature types, said Holt. 2 scouts, 1 carrier. A pause. The carrier is Ninth House configuration. Myra was already at her station. She had been at her station for 2 hours. She had her translation subroutines open, her linguistic matrices running, a mug of cold coffee she hadn't touched. Ninth House, said Reyes, turning to look at her. The Vethkaran were not a unified species the way humans imagined unity. They had houses, ancient clan structures that operated in parallel to their formal military and governmental hierarchy, older than their spaceflight, older than written records, fundamental in ways that human political science didn't have good frameworks for. The houses had specific dialects, specific traditions, specific marks. House membership wasn't just cultural. It was genetic, chemical, deeply physiological. You could tell a Vethkaran's house from a blood sample. You could tell it from the micropheromone signatures they produced without knowing. The Ninth House was small and old and unusual in the Vethkaran context for a reason that had taken Myra 3 years of research to understand fully. The Ninth House believed in debt. Specific, recorded, generational debt. They believed that what was taken must eventually be accounted for. This did not make them kind. They were not kind, they were Vethkaran, and kindness was not a concept their culture had developed the same way humans had, but it made them precise. And it made them, in their own way, predictable. Her mother had been taken by the Ninth House. Myra had spent 12 years being sure of it and unable to prove it. Hailing frequency, she said. Holt looked at the 3 sensor contacts. Myra. Commander, please. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded at Combe. The hail went out. The silence lasted 47 seconds. Myra counted. She had learned to count silences years ago. It helped. Then the channel opened. The voice that came through was not the clicking, harmonic-layered sound of standard Vethkaran speech. It was Ninth House dialect, the softer phonemes, the longer vowels, the particular falling cadence that sounded, to human ears, like water moving over stone. Myra's hands were very still on her console. She said in Ninth House dialect, her accent perfect after 12 years of practice, "I received your signal. I am the child who remembers the fire." Another silence, longer. Then a sound she hadn't heard in 27 years. A laugh specifically, her brother's laugh, Davin's laugh. The one that started in his chest and came out surprised, like it always caught him off guard. She had to put her hand flat on the console to stay upright. They did not let her go across alone. Holt insisted on 4 armed escorts, and she agreed because she understood his position, and because she would have lost the argument anyway, and she understood losing arguments you've already decided to lose. The shuttle crossed 3 kilometers of debris field. The dead station's wreckage turned slowly in the starlight, struts and hull panels and pieces of equipment she couldn't identify, all of it cold and quiet and old. She watched it through the port. She thought about the fact that her brother had been alive this whole time and she had not known it. She thought about what that meant. She thought about whether there was a version of the next hour in which everything went wrong, and filed it under things to think about later. The Ninth House carrier was enormous. Up close, it had the organic quality that all Vethkaran ships had, the hull grown rather than manufactured, the seams biological rather than welded, the whole structure suggesting something that had lived rather than been built. It was dark green-black and older than anything she'd encountered in the border surveys, and it had markings on the bow section she recognized from the linguistic databases, Ninth House eldership sigils. This vessel had been active for at least 300 years. They docked in a bay that smelled of mineral salts and something she tentatively identified as the Vethkaran equivalent of wood, an organic resin they used in certain structural applications. The atmosphere was slightly higher nitrogen than human standard but breathable. Her suit's analyzer confirmed it, and she took off her helmet. Her escort did not take off their helmets. She walked forward into the light. There were 6 Vethkaran waiting. They were tall in the way that still required a specific mental adjustment even after 12 years of working near them. Not threatening in any deliberate posture, simply large, simply present in a way that changed the geometry of the space around them. Their secondary arms were folded. Their sensory clusters were oriented toward her in the way that meant attention, full and direct. And there, on the left, taller than she remembered, marked along the neck and shoulders with the Ninth House secondary lineage glyph that she recognized from the databases, but had never expected to see on her own brother's skin. There was Davin. He looked like their father. He looked like no one she'd ever seen. He looked like someone who had lived a life she knew nothing about and carried it the way people carry lives, not easily, but not without some grace. He was watching her the way she was watching him. Like the last 23 years were a room they were both standing in for the first time, and neither of them was sure of the floor. She crossed to him. She put her hand on his forearm, a Ninth House greeting between marked individuals, an acknowledgement of shared lineage, something she'd learned from the linguistic databases and never imagined using for this. And he made a sound low in his chest that she recognized as the adult version of the laugh she'd heard on the channel. "You learned the dialect," he said. His accent was Ninth House, not overlaid on human phonemes, fundamental. 12 years, she said. Her voice came out even. She was proud of that. "I heard about the survey work, the border routes." He paused. "I knew you were looking." "Why didn't you?" she started, and then stopped, because she already understood the answer and because this wasn't the moment for that question. There were 100 questions and they had time. They had time. That was the thing she had to keep holding on to. Where is she? Davin's expression did something complicated. In Ninth House culture, Complicated expressions meant complicated truths, truths that had more than one layer, truths that required context before they could be properly received. "She is on the ship," he said. "She has been on the ship for 23 years. A pause. He chose the next words with visible care. "She is not," he stopped, started again. "She chose to stay, Myra, after the ceasefire. She chose." The room they brought her to was deep in the ship, past corridors that curved rather than angled, past walls that had the texture of living wood, past chambers she glimpsed briefly through open doorways and couldn't categorize. The light changed as they went deeper, warmer, more amber, the specific quality she'd read about in Ninth House ethnographic documents as inner light, the light of the elder spaces. Her mother was standing at a window. The window looked out on the debris field and the dead moon and the stars beyond, and she was smaller than Myra remembered, which meant nothing, because Myra had last seen her at 4 years old, and every adult is smaller when you're grown. She was 61. She looked like someone who had spent 23 years learning what it meant to be a particular kind of person. She was marked, too, Ninth House secondary lineage, same as Davin, along the neck and the backs of her hands. She turned. Myra had rehearsed this moment roughly 10,000 times in her head over the course of her adult life. She had scripted it, revised it, abandoned the script entirely, scripted it again. Every version fell apart when she tried to hold it up to the reality of the person standing in front of her. She said the only thing that remained when everything rehearsed fell away. "I didn't stop looking." Her mother crossed the room and held her. She was strong, stronger than expected. She smelled of cedar smoke and iron filings, and something sweeter underneath that Myra now had a name for. They stood there for a long time without speaking. Her name was Sierra Dunville. She was a xenobiologist, and she had been one before the taking, and she still was, because the Ninth House did not take people for cruelty, and they did not take them randomly. They had a system, an old, elaborate, frequently bewildering system that operated according to rules Myra spent the next 3 days trying to understand. "We were taken as study subjects," Sierra said on the second day. They were in the elder space together, the amber light warm around them, and Davin was there too, and there was a Ninth House elder named something Myra translated approximately as depth of current, who listened to their conversation without speaking, which was the Ninth House way of indicating respect. Not cruelly, not comfortably at first, but the Ninth House is genuinely interested in humans in a way that the rest of Vethkaran culture isn't. "Why?" Myra said. "Because we ask questions they don't," Sierra said. "That's what depth of current told me, years later. The Ninth House has a concept. I've never found a good human translation. It means something like the animal that argues with its own nature. They found us because humans do a thing they don't. We look for meaning in patterns that might not contain any. We ask whether the universe has a framework, whether there's something under the data." Myra thought of the briefing she'd read years ago in the colonial archives. The God question, that was what the linguists had called it. The question that had circulated through the border translation stations in the early ceasefire years, source never fully identified, evidence for a spiritual framework. The question that a superintelligent translation system had once attempted to parse, and which had come back classified as Ninth House origin. "They were looking for the same answer," she said. "They've been looking for longer," Sierra said, 3,000 years. "They call it the deep current, the thing under everything. They have a machine, it's on this ship, that they've been running for 3 centuries. They feed it all of their knowledge, all of their recorded thought, all of their theological texts and scientific observations and the accounts of their most careful thinkers. They ask it the question. It always gets close and never quite arrives." Davin, who had been quiet, said, "Then about 18 years ago, they started adding human knowledge." Myra looked at him. "Mom's work," he said, "and some of mine, and some they gathered from elsewhere. They added human philosophy, human theology, human science, Human literature. He paused. They added the arguments and the counter-arguments and the doubt. They added the human tendency to hold two contradictory things at once and not collapse from the weight of it. And Myra said. The elder, depth of current, spoke for the first time. The ninth house words moved through the air of the room like water. Myra's translation matrices worked and she listened. The machine arrived at a position, she translated carefully, because the ninth house phrasing was dense and layered and she wanted to get it right. Not an answer, a position, a standing place. It said, the evidence does not confirm, but the absence of evidence does not refute. It said, the question may be of the type that changes the asker. It said, the species that asks the question with the most sustained and unresolved and genuine urgency may be closest to the nature of the question itself. The room was quiet for a moment. It was talking about humans, Myra said. It was talking about humans, her mother confirmed. On the third day, the Vethkaran fleet moved. Myra was in the docking bay when Threshold's alert came through on her comm, and she was back aboard her shuttle before the second ping, and Holt's face on the channel was the face of a man working very hard to remain calm. The 37 ships at the Oren boundary, he said. They've broken formation. Direction. Toward us, 37 ships, Myra. This carrier is not a military vessel. She was already running the numbers in her head. 3 hours at standard transit speed. Less at tactical burn. The carrier had 6 defensive emitters. She'd noted them on approach, and whatever personal weapons the crew carried, and that was the sum total of what stood between her family and 37 Vethkaran warships that had decided this conversation was over. Why, she said, why now? What changed? Comm traffic spiked between the fleet and someone on the carrier about 6 hours ago, Holt said. We intercepted fragments. The translation subroutines are having trouble. Send it to me. The fragments came through. She worked them on the way back through the carrier's corridors, walking fast, her escort jogging to keep up. The language was formal military Vethkaran, not ninth house, and the fragments were partial, but she'd been reading partial transmissions for 12 years. She assembled what she had. The fleet wanted the machine. The 3-century-old thinking engine with its accumulated knowledge and its slowly crystallizing position on the deepest question anyone had ever asked. Someone in the formal Vethkaran military structure had decided that the machine's output was too valuable to remain with a minor elder house. Someone had decided that what the machine had arrived at, not an answer, a position, a standing place, was a political instrument, a weapon, a point of leverage. She thought about that. She thought about what humans had done with the same impulse, the moment some authority decided that a question with no owner needed one. She found depth of current in the elder space. You knew this was coming, she said. The elder's sensory cluster oriented toward her fully. The secondary arms unfolded slightly, a gesture her databases flagged as something between confession and apology. We knew it was a possibility, depth of current said. That's why you sent the signal. That's why you reached out. We needed, the elder paused, chose the words with care, a presence that would complicate a simple action. A human vessel at this location changes the calculation. An attack on this carrier becomes an attack on a human vessel. The ceasefire. You used us as a shield, Myra said. We asked for your presence, depth of current said. We are asking for your help. Myra stood very still. She thought about everything she'd learned in 3 days and everything she'd carried for 27 years. And she thought about the machine in the deep part of the ship that had spent 300 years asking the hardest question and had gotten, finally, close enough to say something true. She thought about what her mother had said. The animal that argues with its own nature. She thought about what the machine had said. The question may be of the type that changes the asker. She activated her comm. Holt, she said, I need you to do something. What she needed was time. Holt gave her time by doing the one thing that Vethkaran military vessels were not procedurally designed to deal with. He talked. He opened every legitimate communication channel available under the ceasefire accords, and he talked. He requested clarification of intent under Article 7. He requested verification of vessel identification under Article 12. He cited precedent from the Meridian Conference and the Harrows Ridge ceasefire annexes, and 3 separate protocols that the fleet commander probably didn't have immediately to hand. He was buying hours, not days, but hours were what she needed. Myra and Davin and Sira went into the deep part of the ship. The machine was not what she'd expected. She had expected something that looked like technology. What it looked like was a room that the ship had grown around, an organic chamber, the walls layered and dense with 3 centuries of accumulated growth, the surface of them covered in inscriptions that were Ninth House writing, but older than any Ninth House text she'd encountered in the databases. The machine itself was embedded in the far wall like something geological, like a formation rather than a device. It had access terminals, 3 of them built in the human style. She noted this with a complicated feeling, and the terminals were active. 18 years, Davin said. Since the human knowledge went in, it's been processing. And it's still processing, Myra said. It processes continuously. It's never stopped. That's not how it works. It doesn't arrive at a conclusion and halt. It keeps going. It keeps refining. She sat down at one of the human interface terminals and opened the access protocols. The machine's architecture was not like anything in the colonial database. It was not like the AI system she'd worked with on the survey ships. It was 300 years old, and it had been built by minds that thought differently than human minds, to ask a question that resisted the approaches of both. She worked carefully. She worked the way she'd learned to work at 19 when she started pulling at the first thin threads, methodically, without attachment to a particular outcome, ready to be surprised. Her mother sat beside her and talked through the access architecture. Her mother had been inside this system for 23 years. She knew it the way you know a place you've lived. Davin stood behind them and watched the door. The fleet was 2 hours out. Holt was on his 5th protocol challenge. It's not a single answer, Sira said, watching the screen. It's never been a single answer. That's what they kept expecting, yes or no, proof or disproof. That's not what it builds. It builds something more like a map, Myra said, reading. A map, yes. A map of the shape of the question, where the evidence accumulates, where the gaps are, where human thought and Vethkaran thought arrive at the same landmark from different directions, where both arrive at the same silence and both find it meaningful rather than empty. Myra read. The translation matrices strained. This was not any dialect she'd trained on. This was the machine's own emergent notation, a synthesis of Ninth House formal script and human mathematical philosophy, and something else she didn't have a word for, something that might have been the machine's own contribution to the conversation. Can it be transmitted? She asked. The full record is 700 exabytes, Davin said. Not the full record, the map, the standing place, the position it arrived at. Silence. It's never been extracted that way, Sira said. I know, can it be done? Her mother looked at the terminal. She looked at the wall of accumulated growth and inscription. She looked at Myra with an expression that Myra recognized from very early childhood, the expression that meant, "This is a large thing you're asking, and I'm not sure, but I believe you." "Give me 40 minutes, she said. They had 38. At 32 minutes, the fleet dropped out of transit drive at the edge of the debris field. Holt's voice on the comm was steady, and Myra loved him for that. 37 warships confirmed. They're demanding the carrier power down all systems and prepare for boarding. Stall. Myra, I have 1 light diplomatic frigate and a crew of 64. I know, stall anyway. At 35 minutes, Myra's mother extracted the position, not the full record, the map, the standing place. Compressed, indexed, in a format that could be transmitted across standard deep space communication architecture. It was 2.3 terabytes. Send it, Myra said. To where? Davin asked. She had been thinking about this. She had been thinking about it since the moment she understood what the machine had built, what 300 years of asking had accumulated. Everywhere, she said, every colonial relay in the border regions, every Vethkaron comm station with an open receiver, every independent outpost and survey ship and trade station in this sector, every node in the ceasefire communication network. She paused. And Meridian Station, especially Meridian Station. Her mother looked at her. Once it's out, Myra said, once it's transmitted to every receiver in the region, it doesn't belong to anyone, not to the Ninth House, not to the military fleet outside, not to the colonial government. It belongs to anyone who wants to read it. It's public knowledge. She paused again. You can't invade a library to recover a book that's already been copied 1,000 times. Depth of Current, who had followed them into the deep space quietly, made a sound. Myra's translation matrices categorized as something between grief and recognition. Not grief at the loss, grief at the rightness, recognition of the thing that had needed to happen and had not quite been imaginable until a human said it out loud. The fleet commander, the elder said, will not be pleased. No, Myra agreed. But the fleet commander will also not have a reason to destroy this vessel. The information is already out. The destruction of this vessel becomes an act of war for no tactical purpose. She looked at the terminal, at the transmission progress. And someone in that fleet is going to have a Ninth House grandmother or a Ninth House uncle who grew up knowing this machine existed. Someone in that fleet has wondered the same question. Everyone wonders the same question. The transmission completed at 37 minutes and 44 seconds. Holt, she said, the transmission just went to every relay in your communication architecture. Make sure Meridian Station confirms receipt. A pause, then. Confirmed. Meridian acknowledges. There another pause longer. They're asking what it is. Tell them it's the output of a 300-year research project, Myra said. Tell them it's not an answer. Tell them it's a map. The fleet did not board the carrier. They held position for 6 hours, and during those 6 hours there was communication traffic between the fleet and the Vethkaron home systems, traffic that Myra could only partially monitor, traffic that had the tenor of something large and institutional reconsidering its position. She recognized the tenor. She had spent 12 years operating in the spaces where large things reconsidered their positions. At the end of the 6 hours, the fleet withdrew to the Oren boundary. Holt said over the comm, with the understatement of someone who had been holding himself together on pure professionalism for 3 days. Well, that worked. Most of it, Myra said. Most of it, he agreed. She stayed on the carrier for another week. There was a great deal to discuss. There were things between her and her mother that took time to unfold, things that could not be rushed because they had weight, and weight requires time. There were things between her and Davin that were different, lighter, and also more complicated. The way things get between siblings who have grown into entirely different people and have to learn each other as adults rather than remembering each other as children. He had been 14 when the taking happened. He remembered more than she did. He remembered the fear of the first months and the slow, grinding process of understanding that this was not ending quickly, and then the longer, slower process of understanding what the Ninth House actually was, what the taking actually meant in their framework. Not conquest, not cruelty, not carelessness, but a form of attention that had no human equivalent and required building entirely new internal architecture to hold. Did you want to come back? She asked him one evening in the elder space, the amber light warm around them. He thought about it with the Ninth House habit of taking questions seriously. For the first few years, yes, he said, constantly, every day, He paused, and then it changed, not because I stopped missing home, but because I built something here that I would also miss. Another pause. I think Mom felt it first. She understood faster. The work here, the machine, the research, it was what she'd been doing her whole career anyway, looking for the pattern under the data. She just found a place where the question was taken seriously. Is she coming home? Myra said. She said it carefully. She had been not asking it for days. I don't know, Davin said. I think you need to ask her. She asked her the next morning. Her mother sat with the question for a long time, long enough that the silence was its own kind of answer, or at least the frame of one. I want to see your father, she finally said. I want to see the colony records. I want to see what the reconstruction looked like. A pause. I've been afraid to see it for 20 years, afraid of what it means that I stayed, afraid that coming back means everything I built here becomes an excuse. It doesn't, Myra said. You don't know that. I know that you were taken, Myra said. Whatever happened after the beginning was not a choice. Whatever you built after, you built in the only space available. She paused. And what you built mattered. What you built is on 600 relay stations right now. What you built is on Meridian Station. Her mother looked at her. The expression on her face was the one from early childhood again, the one Myra had named now that she had a name for it. I want to come home, her mother said. I want to come home, and I don't know what home is anymore, and I think that might be okay. It might be, Myra agreed. The negotiations took months. They always do. Negotiations between large things always take longer than the events that made them necessary, because events are sudden and institutions are slow, and the distance between what happened and what gets officially acknowledged is measured in meetings and documents and carefully worded statements that no one is entirely happy with. The Ninth House Elder delegation came to Meridian Station in the second month. Depth of current was there. Myra was there. Her mother was there, in a context no one had quite prepared for, a human citizen with Ninth House biological markings, a xenobiologist whose name appeared on the machine's research record as a primary contributor, a woman who had spent 23 years in a space between two species and had built something there. The formal Vethkaran government was represented by a delegation that had the look of institutions that have recently been surprised by their own history and have not yet decided how to absorb the surprise. The colonial government delegation had the look of institutions that had recently received 2.3 terabytes of deeply strange data and had not yet decided what to do with it. Myra spent the negotiations in the translation booth, which suited her. Translation booths are honest places. Every word has to be weighed. Every weight has to be considered. You cannot be approximate in a translation booth. Approximation in translation costs exactly what it sounds like. On the fourth day of the negotiations, a Vethkaran military delegate, a senior official from the fleet command structure, not Ninth House, formal and contained and visibly uncertain, asked, through official channels, if the machine's research record could be accessed by Vethkaran academic institutions. The colonial delegate looked at Myra. Myra translated the question. Then she added in the translation something that was technically editorial and therefore slightly outside her role. The record was transmitted to all receivers in the region. It is already accessible to anyone with a standard COM architecture. The Vethkaran delegate's sensory cluster oriented toward her. The secondary arms shifted, the gesture her databases had flagged as surprise, recalibration. You gave it away, the delegate said. It was never ours to own, Myra said. In standard Vethkaran, not Ninth House, deliberate, so everyone in the room understood. The delegate was quiet for a moment. It is a significant work, the delegate said finally. Yes, Myra said. 300 years of asking a question no one has fully answered yet is a significant work. A pause. Your species, the delegate said, and Myra noted the phrasing, your species, not humans, not the specific diminutive the military used, the formal equivalent of acknowledgement, asks the question differently than we do. We ask it with more noise, Myra said, more doubt, more contradictions. She paused. The machine seemed to think that was relevant. She took her mother and her brother home to the Dunville colony site 2 months after Meridian. The colony had been rebuilt, not the same, rebuilt. The original structures were mostly gone, replaced over 25 years with new construction, new streets, new buildings that had the particular character of places that were built by people who remembered what was lost, and were trying to build something that could hold that memory and still be lived in. Her father met them at the transit terminal. He was 63 years old and he walked with a cane, and his eyes were clearer than they'd been for most of her childhood. The doctors had eventually found something to help with the neurological effects of whatever the Vethkaron had done to him during those 8 months, some intervention that had given him back maybe 70% of what he'd lost. Myra had grown up with the 60% version of him. She found the 70% version also difficult and also entirely beloved. He looked at Sira for a long time. He looked at Davin for a long time. He said, I knew you were looking. I knew she wouldn't stop. He was talking to Sira. He was talking about Myra. Myra understood this and let it be. Her brother Ryan was there too, the one who had been returned at the ceasefire, the one who flinched at loud noises, who had spent 25 years building a life in the specific careful way people build lives when they understand how quickly they can be unmade. He looked at Davin with the expression of someone recognizing a version of themselves they never got to be and being, somehow, glad it existed. They stood in the transit terminal for a while, all of them. The lights of the colony were ordinary evening lights. Someone nearby was cooking something with garlic. Someone was arguing far away about something small and domestic, the kind of argument that only happens in places where people feel safe enough to have it. Her mother leaned close to her and said quietly, You smell like the ship. I was on the ship for a week, Myra said. No, you smell like the elder space, the amber light. A pause. It has a smell, cedar smoke and iron. Myra had not consciously noticed. She thought about it now, the specific quality of the air in that deep place, the accumulated centuries of it. I thought that was you, she said. Her mother made a sound, complicated, layered. She was learning to make ninth house sounds with human expression. This one came out as something between grief and recognition. Not grief at the loss, grief at the rightness. Maybe it was both, her mother said. The machine's record continued to be accessed. That was the thing that happened next that no one had entirely predicted, the sheer range of who accessed it. Colonial universities and Vethkaron theological institutes and independent researchers and amateur thinkers, and people who had heard about it on news networks and were curious, and people who had been asking the same question their whole lives and wanted to see what 300 years of serious effort had assembled. It did not answer the question. That was important to say clearly. It did not answer the question. What it had was something more useful and more unsettling than an answer, which was a precise and honest and carefully compiled account of how far serious thought could get and where it arrived and what it found when it arrived there. It was, as Myra had said, a map. Maps are useful in direct proportion to how honestly they record both the known territory and the edges of knowledge. The best maps have here be dragons at the margins, not as a failure but as an honesty, a marking of where the surveyed world ends and the genuine unknown begins. This map had those markings. They were in both ninth house formal script and human notation, and they said in their respective ways, here the evidence accumulates, here the patterns converge. Here we cannot see further, and we are not sure whether that is a limit of our instruments or a property of the terrain. Myra wrote a paper about it. She was not strictly a philosopher or a theologian. She was a xenolinguist who had spent 12 years doing survey work, and she said so in the paper's opening, which some people found refreshingly honest and some people found suspicious. The paper was about the translation problem specifically. What gets lost when a concept moves between species? What gets found? What the gaps in translation reveal about the structure of the concept itself. She used the machine's record as the central case study. She used the ninth house phrase that had brought her here, the remembering fire, the cedar and iron, as the epigraph. The paper was read by several thousand people in the first month, which was more than she'd expected, and generated correspondence from researchers she'd never heard of and some she had, and one letter from a ninth house archivist on the carrier who said, in formal ninth house dialect, that the paper had been read aloud to Depth of Current, who had said, "The human still argues with her own nature. We find this admirable." She read that letter 3 times. She put it in the same folder as the ceasefire archive material, the 12 years of border survey reports, the partial transmission fragments she'd spent a week assembling into something coherent. The folder was large. She was still adding to it. She went back to the border surveys 6 months later. Not because she had to, she had options. Now career options that hadn't existed before Meridian. Offers from institutions that wanted the person who had navigated what she'd navigated. She went back because it was where she was most useful, and because she understood the territory, and because there were still threads out there, thin ones, breaking constantly, requiring someone with patience and 12 years of practice and a working knowledge of 6 Vethkaran dialects. She requested Threshold as her vessel. Holt was still in command. He said when she boarded, "I've been offered a transfer to the inner systems, safer posting, better pay." "Are you taking it?" she said. "I'm still here, aren't I?" he said. Reyes was still there too, and Combe. And most of the crew, the 64 who had held themselves together on professionalism, while a fleet of 37 warships asked them to justify their presence. Good crew. The kind that gets built by going through something and coming out the other side and choosing to stay together. She settled back into her station. She pulled up the border survey maps, the long reaches of unmapped space, the regions where the debris fields and the dead moons and the decommissioned stations still held things nobody had cataloged yet. On her screen, her mother's message from the morning. "The colony is strange and good, and I am learning what it means to be here again. Your father made dinner. Ryan came. It was an ordinary evening, and I did not know how much I needed an ordinary evening." And Davin's message from the carrier. "The Elder Council is debating whether to submit the machine's full record to the joint archive being established at Meridian. Depth of Current thinks we should. The vote is next week. I thought you'd want to know." She looked at the border survey maps. She looked at the long unmapped spaces. She thought, 27 years of looking and it ends like this. Not with a battle, not with a declaration, with a transmission that belongs to everyone and a folder that keeps growing and a message from your mother about an ordinary evening and the faint smell of cedar smoke that you've started to notice in rooms that don't have any wood in them. She thought this is what the machine meant, the question that changes the asker. She opened the survey route and plotted the first bearing. Outside the port, the stars were the same stars they'd always been, indifferent, precise, older than any question anyone had thought to ask them, holding everything and answering nothing and being, somehow in that vast refusal, more than enough to navigate by. She set course. She did not stop looking. She had never learned how.